Let me start by saying neither United States nor Chinese hegemony is truly desirable in a Rothbardian sense. Both are statist empires that violate the non-aggression principle and accumulate power at the expense of individual liberty. However, if we're forced to choose the lesser evil, I'll argue that a continuation of U.S. hegemony is the preferable outcome. Despite America's egregious faults, it at least pays lip service to classical liberal values and has a tradition, however tattered, of respecting some individual rights. By contrast, a world under the Chinese Communist Party CCP, a regime with Orwellian social control at home, would likely be even more stifling to freedom. The CCP literally operates concentration camps for ethnic Uyghurs, over 1 million people detained and re-educated in Xinjiang. That kind of flagrant abuse of rights is a harbinger of what Chinese global dominance might entail. Ethically, then, I maintain that the U.S. system of governance, flawed as it is, aligns closer to libertarian principles than China's one-party communist rule. The American hegemon at least faces some internal dissent and constraints, whereas the CCP tolerates no opposition. The relative freedom of speech in the U.S. means we can condemn our government's imperialism openly. In China, criticizing the party can land you in prison or worse. This errance matters. It means U.S. hegemony contains the seeds of self-correction, public pushback, journalism, elections, whereas China's hegemony would be utterly unaccountable to the public.
I appreciate your acknowledgement that both options are awful from our anarcho-capitalist perspective, but I strongly disagree that U.S. hegemony is the lesser evil. In fact, I will argue the opposite. American hegemony has been the more destructive force, and a Chinese-led world, while hardly utopian, could ameliorate some of the harms by constraining the U.S. warfare state. Let's talk ethics and the non-aggression principle. The U.S. routinely initiates aggression all over the globe. Under Pax Americana, we've seen constant war, from Vietnam to Iraq to Libya, none of them true self-defense. The body count of U.S. imperial policy is staggering. For instance, the post-9/11 wars launched by Washington have killed at least 900,000 people directly, with hundreds of thousands of them being civilians. Millions more were wounded or displaced. This blood-soaked record of the American empire is entirely incompatible with libertarian ethics. By contrast, China's regime, authoritarian as it is, has not inflicted anywhere near that level of worldwide carnage in recent decades. Yes, the CCP brutalizes its own citizens. I'll never defend the Uyghur camps or Tiananmen. But from a geopolitical standpoint, Beijing's foreign policy has been relatively restrained. They aren't carpet-bombing countries on the other side of the world, or drone-striking weddings. Murray Rothbard himself warned us not to assume that a democracy is more peace-loving than a dictatorship. He noted it should occasion no great surprise if a relatively far freer United States has been more aggressive and imperialistic in foreign affairs than a relatively totalitarian Russia or China. History bears this out. The U.S. is the more aggressive empire in practice. Ethically, then, if forced to choose, I side with undermining U.S. hegemony, even if that means China rises, because it might reduce the overall volume of state aggression in the world. Ending the American empire's endless wars would save countless lives and could diminish the warfare-welfare apparatus that violates our rights at home and abroad.
You raise Rothbard's point about democracies versus dictatorships, and I fully acknowledge America's imperial sins. No Rothbardian can justify the Iraq War or drone campaigns that slaughter innocents. But let's scrutinize the claim that Chinese dominance would be better. I find that deeply dubious on multiple fronts: ethical, economic, and geopolitical. Start with ethics and individual liberty. You correctly note China focuses its oppression mostly internally for now, but that's cold comfort. A hegemonic China would export its totalitarian governance model. We already see this happening. Beijing pressures foreign companies and governments to self-censor speech about Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, etc. Look at Hong Kong, a canary in the coal mine. China promised Hong Kong 50 years of autonomy and freedom. They shredded that promise in barely 2 decades. In 2020, Beijing imposed a sweeping national security law that criminalized dissent, and since then Hong Kong has arrested pro-democracy activists, silenced media, and actively ended free speech. As of 2024, new Article 23 legislation has cemented China's rule over Hong Kong, extinguishing the last vestiges of the city's liberties. This is what Chinese hegemony looks like in practice: full-scale assault on rights. Now imagine that model being applied more broadly. Under U.S. influence, places like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Western Europe have flourished as relatively free and open societies. Under Chinese dominance, we could expect a Finlandization, or worse, countries coerced into towing the CCP line, dissidents extradited or disappeared, internet freedom curbed by a global Great Firewall. The non-aggression principle isn't just about bombs falling, it's also about everyday coercion. The CCP's social credit system, surveillance state, and authoritarian controls represent a total negation of liberty. I cannot see how facilitating that global model leads to anything but a darker age of authoritarianism. At least the U.S., hypocritical though it may be, espouses ideals of liberty that activists can hold it to. In a Chinese-led world, the very concept of individual rights could be marginalized.
Hong Kong's fate is indeed tragic, and I don't deny that the CCP's rule is tyrannical. But you're sidestepping a critical point. U.S. hegemony also destroys liberty, just in different ways. It's not as if American global dominance has been a guardian of freedom. Ask people in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, or any number of places bombed or sanctioned by the US how their individual rights fared. The ethical calculation here is grim no matter what, but consider scale and scope. The American empire dominates through hundreds of military bases worldwide, exerting coercion far beyond its borders. The US has roughly 750 overseas military bases in about 80 foreign countries, by far the largest imperial footprint in modern history. Whereas China has maybe a handful, one openly acknowledged base in Djibouti, and a few minor outposts. This vast network is used to project force, prop up client states, and entangle the world in America's fights. US hegemony means drone strikes in Yemen, special forces in Africa, sanctions on Iran and Cuba, and so on. Continuous violations of the non-aggression principle. You mentioned Taiwan, Korea, Europe benefiting under Pax Americana, but it's a double-edged sword. Those regions prospered partly because the US allowed it, yes, but also because their security was essentially subsidized by American taxpayers and achieved at the cost of subjugating others, e.g., the US propped up brutal regimes in the Third World as part of its hegemonic strategy. Meanwhile, countries that didn't fit into the US-led order's plans got ravaged. A Chinese hegemony might be more localized and less ideological. China hasn't shown interest in global ideological crusades to make the world safe for communism, the way the US tries to export democracy, or its version of capitalism, at gunpoint. Often Beijing is content to do business with regimes of any stripe, and doesn't impose its domestic policies abroad, as long as its core interests like One China policy are respected. From a libertarian view, that non-interventionist streak could be a relief. The CCP doesn't care if your country is a democracy or dictatorship, as long as you don't challenge China. In some twisted way, that mind-your-own-business approach is closer to the live-and-let-live ideal than America's relentless meddling. Remember, Rothbardian principle opposes all state aggression. If Chinese dominance reduces the frequency of foreign interventions, because the US can't throw its weight around as much, that is a net positive for global adherence to the non-aggression principle. Fewer drone bombings and regime change wars means fewer innocent people killed. I will take that outcome, even if it comes with the caveat of a powerful but more regionally focused China.
I'm not convinced that a Chinese superpower would remain benign outside its region. Great powers tend to expand their ambitions. But let's pivot to the economic dimension you touched on, since as Austrians we should consider the market implications of each hegemon. Under US hegemony, especially in the post-World War II order, the world has generally seen expanding trade, relatively open markets, and unprecedented prosperity. The American-led system, imperfect as it is, established frameworks like the World Trade Organization, global supply chains, and a dollar-based financial system that lowered transaction costs for commerce. A unipolar power that at least professes belief in free enterprise has allowed capital and goods to flow with some predictability. In contrast, how would a Chinese-led global economy function? The CCP's model is state capitalist mercantilism. Beijing heavily subsidizes state-owned enterprises, manipulates markets, and uses economic leverage for political ends. We already see how China restricts access to its domestic market unless foreign firms dance to its tune: censorship, joint ventures, IP transfer, etc. If China becomes hegemon, we could expect more global coercion in commerce. For example, countries might be forced to use the digital yuan so China can surveil transactions, or to accept Chinese technology standards that facilitate CCP spying. The dollar might lose its reserve status, but replacing it with the yuan, a currency controlled by an opaque communist regime, hardly sounds like an improvement for monetary freedom. At least in the US, the Federal Reserve, as much as we criticize it, operates with some transparency, and there is an ecosystem of alternatives, gold markets, cryptocurrencies, etc., pushing back. In China, they outright ban alternatives. They ban Bitcoin mining and exchanges, for example. And let's not forget property rights. America's legal system, though eroded, does recognize property rights and contracts more robustly than China's does. Under CCP hegemony, the concept of private property could be tenuous. The party claims ultimate authority over all land and major enterprises in China, and they could exert that power abroad. A world economy under Beijing's thumb might see rampant expropriation or debt trap imperialism. Look at how China operates the Belt and Road Initiative. They lend to developing countries for infrastructure, and when those countries can't pay, China seizes strategic assets. A notorious example is Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. Unable to repay Chinese loans, Sri Lanka was pressured into a 99-year lease of the port to a Chinese firm, effectively ceding control. This kind of practice smacks of old-fashioned imperialism, using debt and economic might to grab resources. Under US hegemony, by contrast, while there certainly is economic exploitation, IMF conditionalities, etc., there's also been a general trend toward liberalizing trade and some respect for sovereignty in economic arrangements. The US doesn't typically outright own foreign ports, it prefers influence to direct control. In sum, free market dynamics would likely suffer more under a Chinese hegemon. The US isn't laissez-faire, but it's ranked much higher in economic freedom than China. China ranks near the bottom in global freedom indices, 149th of 165 countries on One Human Freedom Index, whereas the US, despite recent declines, is far closer to the top. If we care about preserving any space for agorist markets or entrepreneurial ventures, an American-led order, where at least some jurisdictions like Singapore, Switzerland, etc. remain semi-free and interconnected with the world, is preferable. A Sinocentric order might tighten political control over markets everywhere, snuffing out the gray and black markets that libertarians rely on to bypass state rules.
The economic angle is important, but I think you're painting an overly rosy picture of US-led global capitalism and an overly grim picture of what Chinese influence would mean. Let's remember, the current world economy under US hegemony is far from a free market. It's a managed, dollar-centric system that enables American fiscal profligacy and federal meddling in money and banking worldwide. The US uses institutions like the Fed, SWIFT, and the IMF World Bank to essentially extort other nations and prop up its own empire. You mentioned the dollar-based system lowering transaction costs. True, it also imposes hidden costs. When the Fed prints trillions, for example QE infinity, it effectively steals purchasing power from every holder of dollars worldwide. This inflation tax funds Washington's deficit spending, much of it on the military. Countries like China have been forced to hold US debt treasuries as reserves, meaning their savings fuel America's wars and welfare. If Chinese hegemony ends that dynamic, it could ironically impose more market discipline. For example, if the dollar loses its privileged status, the US government couldn't finance endless trillions in debt. It might actually have to curtail spending, including on its military adventures, or face hyperinflation at home. That scenario could be painful for Washington, but from an Austrian economic standpoint, it's a necessary correction. The world might return to more sound money, perhaps a multipolar reserve system with greater roles for gold, or even decentralized cryptocurrencies if trust in both the dollar and yuan falter. The US has shown it will abuse its financial power. Consider how it freezes the reserves of any rogue state, punishing entire populations via sanctions. Just recently, the US weaponized the global payment system to an unprecedented degree, for example, kicking Russia out of SWIFT, seizing Afghanistan's central bank funds. This sets a dangerous precedent that no international asset is safe from US political whims. A Chinese-led system would be no saint either, but at least power would be balanced. Nations could play China and the US and others off each other to preserve their economic autonomy. In a unipolar US world, there's no escape from Uncle Sam's financial grip. If we move to a more multipolar world, with China as a major pole, countries have alternatives. They can trade outside the dollar system already happening with bilateral currency deals, which makes it harder for any one hegemon to impose universal rules. This pluralism can create cracks where free market exchanges and agorist activities thrive. Think of it this way. During the Cold War, having two superpowers competing sometimes gave smaller nations more leeway. They could align with one or stay non-aligned to get concessions from both. Similarly, in a world where the US can't dictate alone, there's a chance for decentralization of power. As libertarians, we favor checks and balances. A single superpower is like a monopolist, with no check on its aggression. Two or more powers competing is closer to a market of governance, not ideal. But competition could force each to restrain excesses, lest they drive allies to the other side. For example, if the US remained hegemon, it has no incentive to reform its inflationary policies or its surveillance state. It knows everyone is stuck in its system. But if China threatens US dominance, the US might have to liberalize in some areas to attract allies and investors. We've seen a bit of this. Faced with China's rise, some in Washington suddenly recall the virtues of domestic manufacturing, or even consider cutting spending to strengthen the economy. On the flip side, China's leaders, to truly overtake the US, have had to allow far more capitalism than Mao would ever tolerate. Deng Xiaoping's reforms were essentially an admission that markets work, and those reforms created hundreds of millions of relatively freer Chinese entrepreneurs within limits. A China that wants to be economic top dog can't kill the golden goose of market activity. They learned that after Mao's disasters. Lest we forget, Mao's centrally planned Great Leap Forward caused tens of millions of deaths in a famine, a catastrophic lesson in anti-market policy. Today's CCP is authoritarian, yes, but they do let markets operate in many spheres because they know their power depends on economic growth. This means a Chinese hegemon might paradoxically be constrained by global market forces. If they clamp down too hard, they lose their edge. Meanwhile, the US coasts on the dollar's dominance and often ignores market signals. I'm not saying China will usher in free markets, far from it. But US leadership hasn't been a pure boon for economic freedom either. Both states intervene massively. The question is which hegemony leaves more room for private innovation and exchange. I maintain that an end to the US empire and its dollar empire could open up space for monetary innovation and remove the blanket of US regulations that gets imposed via trade agreements. For instance, the US pushes strict intellectual property laws worldwide, TRIPS agreements, etc., which many libertarians, especially left-market anarchists, critique as state-backed monopolies. If US influence wanes, maybe alternative IP regimes or open-source innovation could flourish without the WTO's one-size-fits-all rules. Agorists might find more havens to operate if Washington's reach contracts. Today, An American can hardly escape the IRS or FATCA anywhere on Earth due to US hegemony. Break that, and offshore havens or crypto economies might proliferate despite both Washington and Beijing disapproving. It's a gamble, I grant you, but so is assuming the US will suddenly embrace laissez-faire while on top. At least shaking up the status quo might loosen some shackles.
We're both speculating on complex scenarios. Neither of us can predict with certainty how a Chinese-led world would play out economically. So let's turn to the geopolitical realism aspect, since that heavily influences our ethical and economic outcomes. Here, I think the case for US hegemony being safer is strong. History teaches that power transitions between hegemons are extremely dangerous. A rising China challenging a declining us could lead to major wars. The Thucydides' trap, as classical realists call it, is the idea that when one power rises to displace another, conflict often ensues. We saw this with the World Wars, Germany rising against Britain's order, and countless other times. Preserving US hegemony, if it can be done without war, at least avoids a potentially catastrophic great power war between the US and China. A world where China tries to dominate could involve a hot war over Taiwan or the South China Sea. That conflict could easily draw in other states and even go nuclear. US-China war would be horrific beyond measure. In fact, some analysts note the US military has openly prepared war plans against China, the thought of which should scare any libertarian, since nuclear war is the ultimate violation of the NAP, it's mass murder. By maintaining a strong US deterrent, we might dissuade China from ever attempting forcible expansion. US hegemony, in effect, has kept a relative peace among the great powers since World War II. The major powers haven't fought each other directly under Pax Americana. Instead, conflicts have been smaller in scale, though not small to the victims, I admit. But imagine a multipolar free-for-all. China, Russia, the US, India, all jostling for primacy. The likelihood of big wars increases. Rothbardians are anti-war always, so we should prefer the configuration that minimizes the chance of a new world war. I contend that is a stabilized US-led order. Geopolitically, the US also has allies and semi-voluntary partnerships, whereas China's potential hegemonic sphere would likely be more coercive. American hegemony is buttressed by alliances like NATO, ANZUS, bilateral treaties with Japan, Korea, etc., where countries joined mostly by choice because they saw mutual benefit, or at least mutual threat, from the USSR historically. These alliances, while entangling, also create a predictable structure that deters rogue actions. If the US retreats and China fills the void, many of those alliances could crumble or flip sides under duress. Smaller nations in Asia are already feeling the pressure without the US security umbrella. Countries like Vietnam or the Philippines might have to bend the knee to Beijing's demands over maritime claims, for example. That would represent a loss of political self-determination for those nations, effectively a new tributary system under China. As libertarians, we support self-determination and secession. US hegemony, ironically, has created conditions where more nations can remain independent rather than being swallowed by a regional empire. Think of Taiwan. It has de facto independence and a vibrant free society only because US hegemony keeps China at bay. A Chinese hegemonic victory would almost certainly mean the end of Taiwanese liberty by violent conquest if necessary. Is that outcome preferable in any sense? I say no. It'd be a tragedy for 24 million people and a huge setback for liberty in Asia. Furthermore, consider the balance of power on human rights. When the US is strong, dissidents in China or other authoritarian states have some external support, even if just moral support. If China is dominant, who will speak for the oppressed? Certainly not the UN. China's influence there would grow. Tibetans, Uyghurs, Taiwanese, Hong Kongers. Their plight would be completely ignored in a world where Beijing's might cows everyone. At least under US influence, there's been some advocacy, albeit politicized at times, for oppressed minorities. I return to the fundamental libertarian insight. The state is the enemy of liberty, and the stronger the state, the worse for the people. A Chinese global hegemon would be an even stronger state in terms of control than the US hegemon is, because of how CCP governs. I fear a world state of Chinese characteristics, far more than a world order managed clumsily by a relatively freer society like the US. Maintaining US hegemony isn't an endorsement of US statism. It's a grim recognition that if someone's going to hold enormous power, better the one constrained even slightly by constitutionalism and a libertarian minority than one unconstrained and rooted in totalitarian ideology.
Even if the US is bad, keeping it on top prevents something worse, a catastrophic war or a more draconian overlord. I understand the logic, but I find it unpersuasive for a few reasons. First, US hegemony isn't as peaceful or stable as you make out. True, the great powers haven't directly warred since 1945. But we came dangerously close multiple times, Cuban Missile Crisis for example, because of superpower competition. We're arguably in a similar Cold War now, and it's a result of the US insisting on global dominance and NATO expansion right up to others' borders. Sometimes a hegemon's overreach provokes the very war it seeks to prevent. If the US would accept a multipolar world, maybe China's rise could be managed without war. There's a scenario where the US remains powerful but yields regional hegemony in East Asia to China, which frankly, is China's backyard. But Washington's bipartisan establishment refuses to concede an inch. They talk of containing China at all costs, which increases the chance of war over Taiwan or some miscalculation in the South China Sea. A geopolitical realist might argue that granting China sphere of influence, much as the Monroe Doctrine did for the US and the Americas, could actually diffuse tensions and avoid a global showdown. In other words, letting China become the dominant regional hegemon in Asia, without trying to run the whole world, might be the stable equilibrium. But that requires the US to step back gracefully. Under continued American hegemonism, we're heading toward collision as China grows. Second, about alliances and self-determination, there's an assumption that US alliances equal to benevolent protection of free nations. Sometimes that's true. I too worry for Taiwan's freedom. But other times US alliances have stifled self-determination. Think of how the US treated Iran's democracy and couped it to install the Shah, or Chile, or how the US propped up military dictators in South Korea, Taiwan, Greece, etc. For many years during the Cold War, the US often prefers friendly regimes to truly independent ones. A Chinese hegemon would certainly do the same in its sphere, I'm not denying that, but the point is, great powers abuse small nations under any hegemon. Perhaps under multipolarity, a small nation has more room to maneuver. You could see new non-aligned movements emerge, playing powers off each other to preserve autonomy. When there's only one hegemon, you're either a vassal or an enemy. With two, you can be a swing state. For libertarian-minded enclaves, that might offer breathing space. Imagine seasteads or free cities negotiating recognition or tolerance from multiple powers by not being exclusively in one camp. It's speculative, but monopoly power, even at the international level, is more dangerous to liberty than competing powers. You fear a world state of Chinese characteristics, but I already fear the embryonic world state of American characteristics. With us-driven institutions imposing regulations on finance, trade, travel, surveillance, think Five Eyes intelligence, or the pressure on every country to adopt US security theater standards, etc. Break that unipolarity, and none of these states can so easily globalize their control systems. They'll be too busy checking each other. Also, you mentioned nuclear war risk. Absolutely, that's the biggest horror. But continuing on the current path doesn't eliminate that risk, it might just delay it. A desperate us trying to cling to hegemony might act as rashly as any rising power. And a hegemonic US is not immune to nuclear recklessness either. Who dropped the only nuclear bombs in history? The United States at a point of unchallenged power in 1945. Who considered a first strike during Cold War? Some American strategists did, and some Soviets too, of course. My point. Concentrated power is a threat to peace in itself. If US dominance leads to the encirclement and strangulation of China, at some point China might strike out, it's cornered. But if the US weren't encircling China with bases and alliances, which is happening, even US analysts talk about encircling China, maybe China wouldn't be so paranoid or aggressive in response. As libertarians, we often recognize that intervention produces blowback. US hegemony has already created blowback. Militant groups, anti-American hatred, even the rise of China itself was enabled by US economic policies that now backfired. I'm not convinced that doubling down on the American empire yields long-term stability. It could just be winding up the spring for a more devastating conflict later. In contrast, a managed transition to Chinese or multipolar hegemony, while scary, could lead the US to retrench. And here's a crucial libertarian consideration. A US retrenchment could mean the empire turns inward, possibly collapsing or at least shrinking the federal government's domestic power. Think about the end of other empires. When Britain lost its empire, it had to liberalize its economy in the late 20th century to survive Thatcher's reforms, and it could no longer afford massive militarization. When the Soviet Union collapsed, an evil empire if ever there was one, its successor states gained more freedom than before. Russia in the 1990s had more freedom of speech and market activity than under Soviet rule. Alas, Putin reversed some of that, but still, if the American empire collapses or recedes, it could actually rejuvenate liberty within the US. There'd be less justification for the surveillance state, no global war on terror to fight, fewer resources for the military-industrial complex, and perhaps a revival of federalism as DC's influence wanes. Imagine the US forced to abolish overseas bases for cost or treaties. You'd have troops coming home, military spending slashed, maybe even bases on US soil closing, which could reduce the military's imprint on civilian life. The national security excuse for every erosion of civil liberties might weaken. Heck, Americans might even embrace a more modest republic again, as the old right wanted, instead of global policemen. This is somewhat hopeful, but history shows empires can evolve into more normal nations post-hegemony. On the Chinese side, if they become top dog, they'll face their own limits. There's evidence China's power might peak and then decline due to demographics, debt, etc. One Mises Institute analysis argues China faces imminent multi-front domestic crises threatening the CCP's rule. So a Chinese hegemony might not cement a new 100-year empire. It could be a short-lived phase that breaks up the old US unipolarity without establishing a stable unipolar Chinese century. In that turbulence, yes, there are risks, but also the possibility that no single Leviathan will ever dominate so totally again. We might get a few big states that have to tolerate each other and maybe leave people alone more than now, simply because they can't risk constant intervention. In sum, I see possible pathways to greater liberty in a world where U.S. hegemony ends, whereas under perpetual U.S. hegemony, I see a steady erosion of liberty. The TSA gropes get more intrusive, the NSA keeps spying, the deficits mount, the wars never really end. Neither scenario is great shakes for anarcho-capitalists, but I'd rather bet on the empire choking on its own hubris and giving us a shot to rebuild liberty from the ruins, than bet on the empire benevolently maintaining freedom with its iron grip. History and Rothbardian theory both cast doubt on the latter.
Your vision is certainly impassioned. You're essentially rooting for a creative destruction of the American empire, hoping that from its decline a freer world could emerge. I too long for the end of all empires. I just fear what fills the void. The crux is that both of our positions are a bit tragic. We're debating which status Leviathan should predominate, which is almost a devil's bargain for libertarians, but we owe it to intellectual rigor to weigh these outcomes. I remain convinced that U.S. hegemony, for all its crimes, is the less disastrous context for liberty to survive and perhaps advance. The American empire at least carries within it the ideals of 1776, however betrayed they are in practice, and those ideas still inspire resistance and reform. Chinese hegemony would center a regime that explicitly rejects our ideals of natural rights and limited government. Even if the U.S. implodes, and somehow we get a rebirth of liberty at home, which is speculative, the interim could be a global dark age under CCP leadership, from which recovering liberty might be even harder. Imagine a world where surveillance technology built in China, AI-driven censorship, facial recognition becomes the worldwide norm that could entrench authoritarianism everywhere, including a post-empire America. I worry that you underestimate how pernicious Chinese influence could be on other governments. Many authoritarians admire the China model of control and growth. We already see developing countries importing China's internet firewall tech and social credit ideas. If China were hegemon, that export of tyranny would accelerate. It could poison the well for libertarian movements in countless countries, hard to organize when Big Brother is watching with China-made surveillance. By contrast, American cultural influence, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, etc., at least popularizes individualistic and entrepreneurial values worldwide. There's a reason dissidents in China use the Statue of Liberty as a symbol, not some Chinese equivalent. Cultural hegemony matters too, and U.S. hegemony, at its best, spread a culture of personal freedom, even as the government often contradicted it. Chinese cultural dominance might spread collectivism and obedience. So, ethically and culturally, I still see the U.S. as closer to our camp than China.
Fair points on culture, though some would argue Hollywood spreads as much decadence or statism as freedom, but I get your meaning. And yes, this is a tragic dilemma for anarchists. I'm not cheering the CCP by any stretch. I'm strategically saying the downfall of the current hegemon might open doors for liberty that the status quo keeps shut. Perhaps I'm a bit of an accelerationist in that regard. I think of Rothbard's insight: war is the health of the state. The U.S. hegemon has been in a perpetual state of war or preparation for war, which has indeed engorged the State Patriot Act, military-industrial complex, you name it. If U.S. hegemony wanes, maybe that wartime footing can finally relax, and the state's health can decline. On the other hand, you rightly note a Chinese-led world might introduce its own wars on liberty, a war on free expression, etc.
Ultimately, we're weighing different risks to liberty. My stance: U.S. hegemony is the devil we know, tempered by an internal libertarian tradition and some checks and balances. It has caused immense harm, but it also maintained a relative liberal world order where commerce and ideas mostly flowed. Chinese hegemony is the devil we don't fully know, but given the CCP's track record, it could be even more suffocating: a world order of surveillance, censorship, and client despotisms. For ethical, economic, and geopolitical reasons, I find us predominance preferable to Chinese predominance, insofar as those are the options. The best outcome, of course, is no hegemons at all, a world of peaceful, voluntary polycentrism. But until we can achieve that Rothbardian dream, I'll cast my lot with the American quasi-imperial pax as the marginally better context, hoping that we libertarians can keep fighting to restrain its abuses and inch toward liberty.
And my conclusion is that U.S. hegemony's continuance likely means continual war and Leviathan's growth, whereas a Chinese challenge might break the U.S. empire's back, creating an opportunity to build a more libertarian future in the cracks of the old order. It's a high-stakes gamble, I admit. There are genuine ethical and economic downsides either way, and I don't want either state ruling the world. But if forced to choose, I'll prefer a scenario where the overextended American empire falls, even if that means a period of Chinese ascendancy, because only through the former's fall can we possibly reset the trajectory away from global statism. In the spirit of Rothbard's radicalism, sometimes you have to dismantle the dominant power structure to let something freer emerge.
It's the classic debate between a Burkean libertarian and a revolutionary libertarian, perhaps. Do we preserve what is relatively better and reform gradually, or do we smash the biggest tyrant and take our chances with the fallout? We've each made our case with passion and reason.
Indeed. While we differ on preferred outcomes, we share the same ultimate goal: a world set free. And in either scenario, U.S. or Chinese hegemony, We'll have our work cut out for us as libertarians, opposing all infringements on liberty. Perhaps the real takeaway is that we must continue building the ideas and institutions of freedom so that no hegemon can crush them.
Here. On that we strongly agree.